Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Alhamdulillah, we're very happy tonight to continue yet another Facebook live sessions with our guests of Sout Ilaahi. And Alhamdulillah, as you know, tonight and the next few nights, we are having our film festival, the Sout Ilaahi Muslim Arts and Film Festival. It's our inaugural film festival, and we are very excited to have exciting lineups for you. And we have poets, we have writers, we have singers, filmmakers who will be featured, inshallah, both local and international acts. And we hope that, inshallah, through this, we will be able to raise the human conscience, inshallah, towards positive change in society and humanity, inshallah. We're very happy tonight. Tonight's topic is connection to the soul, the meaning and role of films, with none other than CD Michael Sugich. And, tonight it will be a conversation with him. And we're very excited to have him on board, inshallah. But before I even bring him on board, inshallah, I'll let you know a little bit more about him, inshallah. Bismillah. CD Michael Sugich is a native of Santa Barbara, California, and he studied at UCLA and the California Institute of the Arts. He was initiated into a traditional Sufi order in 1972. Since that time, he has studied Sufi doctrine and practice with spiritual masters across the Arab and Islamic world. He lived for 23 years in the precincts of the sacred city of Makkah al-Mukarramah, where he kept company with many men of knowledge and illumination. He has written Palaces of India, a travel book, and Living in Makkah, a children's book, and most recently a feature documentary film on the life of King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, Faisal, Legacy of a King. CD Michael Sugich is author of Signs on the Horizons, Meeting with Men of Knowledge and Illumination, a memoir of 40 years with Sufi saints of the 20th and 21st centuries. And without further ado, we'd like to invite CD Michael Sugich on the screen. Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum, CD Michael.
Wa alaikum salam. How are you?
Alhamdulillah. I'm good. How are you, CD Michael?
I'm good. Thank you for inviting me. I'm honored to be considered worthy of your
Astaghfirullahalazim. Astaghfirullahalazim. I think we are the ones who are very happy to have you on board. In fact, thank you for accepting our invitation. As Sidi Khalid mentioned, it's always an honor to have you for our program. I think recently we had you in Singapore for a talk. And alhamdulillah, we're very happy.
Last year I was there. I loved Singapore, by the way. It was fantastic. I'd never been to Singapore before, and I thought it was just a big city like Dubai or something, but it's much more than that. I love the city. I hope I can come back sometime, inshallah.
Inshallah. I remember that event in Singapore. It was a very closely knit session. And I think even at the end, when people were asking the questions, they were very happy, and they were very happy that they could speak to you personally about what you spoke about. And inshallah, tonight we'll continue that conversation, inshallah. Right. Tonight, CD Michael, the topic is on the connection to the soul, the meaning and role of films. You've had a lot of experience, as a writer as well, and also someone who deeply appreciates film. And I believe tonight, inshallah, is going to be a session that I hope, inshallah, a lot of people are going to benefit from. And, it's going to be, inshallah, a conversation that I think is almost like a continuation of the event that we had last year.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Inshallah. Yeah.
Well, fire away.
Alhamdulillah. All right. Okay. CD Michael, I think the first question it's with regards to films itself, right? I think for all of us, that they said during the event last year, one of the questions that we are interested in knowing is how do you first develop an interest in films? Because you spoke rather passionately about films, and based on your experience and also your reflection on films. Our question is, how do you first develop an interest in it? And is there a particular genre of films that you have a soft spot for?
Well, the first part of your question, I first developed an interest in film as an art form in university. Of course, I grew up with films. Everyone from of my age and before, we grew up watching movies. But as an art form, I began to appreciate film more deeply at UCLA, the University of California in Los Angeles, where I was studying. It was there that I was exposed to the silent cinema, which absolutely blew me away. I mean, I'd seen Laurel and Hardy movies and clips from Chaplin and so on, but I saw Buster Keaton's masterpiece, The General, for the first time on a wide screen, and actually with live accompaniment by one of the last organists from the silent period. It was a stunning experience. I saw Preston Sturges' film Sullivan's Travels and was knocked out. The legendary silent film director, Joseph von Sternberg, turned up and presented The Docks of New York. So I was exposed to some extraordinary cinema that I wouldn't have been otherwise. I saw Erich von Stroheim's masterpiece, Greed. These are films that you really have to go out of your way to look for, to find and see. At university, I was exposed to the French New Wave films of Truffaut, Godard, Jacques Demy. But at that time, I was primarily interested in theater and music as a performer, an actor and a singer. And I never gave any thought to actually making movies, just being in them. And it was only later, after I had left show business and begun to make a living as a writer, that I developed an interest in writing about film, and then later on writing film script. I was never interested in writing for Hollywood because I'd seen how frustrating and depressing that was from watching screenwriter friends of mine in the business. It's a very, very discouraging business to try to get a screenplay actually made. In the late 1980s, I gradually began writing information or documentary films, and I really love doing that. It's a great pleasure for me to write, especially information films or documentaries. So over a period of about 10 years, I wrote dozens of corporate and documentary films, and that's kind of the extent of my engagement as a film writer, as it were. Ironically, I developed a much deeper interest in cinema when I was living in Saudi Arabia. I needed to make a living as a writer there, and I was asked to write a weekly column on Islamic culture for one of the daily newspapers. But I didn't think I could sustain the subject because I really didn't have the academic background or actually access to the literature there. So I countered with a suggestion to write a column on film because I knew a little bit about the subject, and this was the early days of video. And everybody in the kingdom was watching movies at home on video. So I wrote this weekly column on film for 7 years and really educated myself on the aesthetics of cinema during that period. As far as genre goes, I have very eclectic tastes, and I can't really say that I have a soft spot for any particular genre. However, there are genres I intensely dislike. I really don't like science fiction, and I hate horror films, to name two. So next question.
Sorry, Sidi Michael, I think just now there was a bit of connection issue towards the end.
Okay.
I think you mentioned that you hate two genres, and namely horror and science fiction.
That's right. Science fiction, horror, I don't like them. I avoid them. I avoid them. And,
Is there any reason
Huh?
in particular? Maybe just so that you know.
Like, well, I think science fiction, I think, is it's a way for people who can't believe in the unseen to explain things, and I just find it silly, frankly. Most science fiction, I mean, it's not silly because, you know, in terms of technology and things. I mean, there was a film that I did rather enjoy watching called Gravity, but it was more because of the unbelievable technology that was employed in shooting the film. But the story I thought was silly, frankly. You know, it was like this school teacher or something, you know, navigating her way from outer space and being
Yeah.
put in that position in the first place. It was kind of ridiculous. But anyway, I don't, and I loathe horror movies. And maybe that goes back to my childhood, because I remember they reissue, or they what do you call it when they bring back an old film? Um, uh, Frankenstein.
Oh, Frankenstein. All right.
You know,
Remake.
that was redistributed when I was a child, so it was already an old film,
Right.
and it scared the wits out of me. I mean, I was absolutely terrified. It's an amazing film, actually, but I just don't like it because it's dark. Horror is a very dark, and
Yes.
it's not a particular. I think it's an unsavory medium, and it preys on the sort of lowest impulses
Interesting.
an audience has, and I don't like it.
I think yeah, that's very interesting, CD Michael. I think I also struggle trying to understand horror films as well. And you mentioned the film Gravity, and Gravity. I really like how the visual graphics of it was really amazing, just like you mentioned. But the storyline wise, I think it's something that you mentioned is something that you kind of focus on. Would you say that story is something that's important for you in that sense? The most important thing about a film?
It's very important. In fact, one of the who was it? I can't remember. There's one of the old time movie moguls was
Right.
asked what the most important aspect of the film is, and he said it's the story, but we don't want our story writers to know that, because
Okay.
they didn't pay them a lot, you know, at that time, so they didn't want them. But
Right.
anyone who makes films will tell you that everything is in the screenplay. If you have a great script, great screenplay, you can make a great film. Or if you're not very good, you can make a good film. If you have a terrible screenplay, it doesn't matter how good you are, the film isn't going to be that great. Everything is in story, and you know, particularly there's a great one of these old Hollywood stories about Lawrence of Arabia. Um, there's an extraordinary scene where Peter O'Toole as Lawrence decides to go to the desert, and he strikes a match. The match flares up and it becomes the sun, right? Now, the director, David Lean, was given all the credit for that, but that was written in the script by Robert Bolt. That was in the script. That wasn't David Lean. That wasn't his idea, but he got all the credit because he's the director. You know? So the screenplay, but it's also a very, very depressing, discouraging way to make a living. You know, some people, you know, if you're successful, you're lucky and successful, and you're good at what you do, then you can have. But most, it's very depressing. I have lots of horror stories about screenwriters, you know, having, you know, really having a hard time.
But that's interesting, CD Michael. On that same thread, you know, what are some of the characteristics of films that make it particularly good or bad? Are there certain things, traits in film that make it better for you? Yeah.
Well, for me, most importantly, I have to care about the characters, who they are, who are they, how they change, what happens to them. One of the things you see in a lot of bad films is people that you don't really care about, whether they're alive or dead, or, you know, and one of the reasons that being a movie star is so important is that there are certain actors who can just generate sympathy just by being on the screen, but it's not the whole thing. You have to care about the characters. Then you have to look for originality. I mean, most mainstream movies and a whole lot of independent films are abysmally derivative. They're just retread movies, retreads of other movies. The late screenwriter William Goldman really nailed Hollywood when he wrote nobody knows anything. And what he meant by that is that nobody in Hollywood knows what will succeed. So what they do is endlessly copy recently successful movies. And you know, if you watch enough movies, you start seeing and say, oh my God, this is going to happen. Oh my God, I've seen this before 50 times, and so on and so forth. Of course, we look at a movie as a whole, but movies are the sum of many parts: script, production design, costume design, cinematography, direction, casting, acting, music, the whole package. Hundreds of very talented people work on film. And yet, nobody really knows for sure if the movie they're working on will find an audience and succeed. Some just don't, you know, they just miss the point because it's such a huge undertaking.
Yes.
You know, so yeah, so that's what I look for. And I also look for sincerity. I think, you know, people talk about truth. I think that's a pretentious word. But something that I look for, something that touches my heart, that lifts me up in some way, teaches me something, or takes me into a new world. And of course, that experience is highly subjective. I remember watching Francis Ford Coppola's Vietnam War epic, Apocalypse Now, with the poet Daniel Moore and a Vietnam vet. And I found the film to be completely unbelievable, grossly unrealistic and overblown. And I really didn't like it at all. But the Vietnam vet was mesmerized. And while we were watching one of the most outrageously surrealistic scenes, he said, "This is exactly how it was."
Oh.
So there you go. I mean, it's very, looking at film is a very subjective experience. I mean, I might loathe Marvel Comics movies, but they mean something to someone, maybe you know, a younger generation. I have no idea. So, you know, there's that as well. But you look for the quality of the film, the way the images, you know, the cinematography is a huge part of filming. A cinematographer contributes an enormous amount to a film. And also the sound design. There are all kinds of things that add to a film. But if the story is lousy, if the characters are uninteresting, if it has a terrible ending, I mean, a lot of films fail at the ending. So you find a lot of films that start really well, and then they get to the ending, and then they cheat on the ending. They have the car driving away, you know,
in the distance.
They can't figure out an interesting way to end the thing, so the car is driving into the horizon or something like that, you know. So anyway,
that's very interesting, Senior Michael, because I think even before I wanted to ask the question, you kind of already answered it, which is, you know, whether, you know, the films now are very formulaic, whether it's really cut and paste. And also, you know, I mean, you mentioned about a few things that were very interesting. I felt you said that something very important in films is the sincerity and whether you cared for the characters. And I think that the reality of sincerity in a film or in a filmmaker on how they make the films, I guess, is something that's not really talked about nowadays, even in modern times. Why do you feel that this is such a integral part of, you know, filmmaking and, you know, screenwriting? Sincerity.
What's sincerity? Well, it's believing in what you do. I mean, look, there are in every discipline there are people who have integrity, and then there are hacks, people who are doing it. You know, it's a job of work, and there's nothing. I mean, to a certain extent, everybody's like that because everyone wants to make a you know, make a living. I'll give you an example about that. It's a funny example. A friend of mine, when we were young, this is when we were young. He was a contract player for Columbia Pictures, and he was just starting out, and he landed the fifth lead in a movie that was starring, if I can remember correctly, Robert Shaw, who was the star of Jaws, who just come off of Jaws, right? So Robert Shaw, Sally Kellerman, who just come off, she'd been nominated for an Oscar for MASH. There were about five. Sandra Locke, who, you know, also had I think was Oscar nominated and so on. So there were all these, hot actors, and
Yes.
he came onto the set. This was his first movie, but when we were sharing a house in LA, and he was reading the script, and he kept saying, "I don't understand it. I don't get it. This is the worst script I've ever read in my life. It's horrible. I really don't, because I must not understand it because all these great people are in this movie, so anyway, he got on the set and he greeted all the actors and they were very nice and he relaxed. And so he said, "Look, I have to ask you something. I'm doing this because this is my first movie. This is my break,
Yeah.
but why are you doing it?" He said, "This is like the worst script I've ever read." And they all, he said that everything went silent.
Oh.
And Robert Shaw just shrugged and he said, "Well, it was the best thing going." And that's what a lot of people in the business, it's the best thing going. Whatever's going, whatever will pay their bills, you have to pay their mortgages and alimonies and all of the other stuff that and their kids' schooling. So they do whatever they have to do, and everybody's kind of like that.
Right.
And so yes, things become kind of routine.
And CD Michael, I think by that same thread, you mentioned about routine and all that. Do you think that because of this, it kind of affects the deeper messaging that films can actually convey, in a sense that they create films like what you mentioned, cut and paste, and also derivatives of others, and as a result, they don't really have a deeper essence and lesson or meaning behind the messaging. Do you think modern day films have lost that so-called magic of deeper messaging?
Well, I don't think altogether that's true, but I do agree that things have changed and not for the better. You have to understand that the movie business has always been about box office. And for that reason, it's inevitably formulaic. There have been times when European governments supported film as an art form, but generally speaking, making movies is a business. But during the age of the studio system in the US, from the 1920s to the 1950s, the movie business was in the hands of movie moguls like Louis B. Mayer, Harry Kahn, the Warner Brothers. They weren't artists, they were businessmen, always looking at the bottom line, but they loved movies. They were devoted to the industry. They specialized in movies, and some of them even had a conscience. Harry Warner, for example, was dedicated to making movies with a message, like I Was a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, which had an incredible impact on the prison system, on prison reform. But with the gradual disintegration of the studio systems beginning in the 1950s, movie studios were taken over by corporate conglomerates run by accountants and lawyers who had no vested interest in movies except to increase return to their shareholders. And this has had a terrible impact on the content and quality of movies.
Yes.
I have a very gifted screenwriter friend. He's British. He writes highly intelligent, really fascinating screenplays. He was called to Hollywood to meet with studio executives interested in a screenplay he wrote. But when he got there, the studio executive he met said something like, yeah, we like your script, but do you think you can write a horror movie? Because horror movies make money.
Makes money.
Mainstream movies now take a huge amount of money to make, tens and hundreds of millions of dollars. Studio executives who have to answer to their corporate overlords look at the numbers and base their decisions on what is going to be made on whatever movies made money the year before. And they recycle those same ideas until they stop making money. So you have all these Marvel Comics movies, one after another after another. And every once in a while, a movie with a message slips through the cracks and scores, like Birdman, for example, or Spotlight, or the beautiful Mexican film Roma. These are incredible films, but they're exceptions, they're outliers, and they can't be imitated. I mean, you can't do Roma 2 or Spotlight 2, or even Birdman 2. You just it's not something you can do. I once attended a talk by George Clooney at the Dubai Film Festival, and he said that because of the advances in technology, this is the best time ever for aspiring filmmakers. All you need is a digital film camera package and a laptop, and you can make a movie. But the biggest challenge for young filmmakers is distribution. You can make a movie, but how do you get the movie seen? It's not so easy.
Yes.
So
So that's a challenge. I would say that those bigger companies, the moguls, they'll probably have those that kind of power where they can actually market it and reach out to a wider audience, right? CD.
well, I'll tell you, my doctor in England has one of her patients and also close friends is a very major film producer, a big time film producer. And she said that she's been trying to make films that have a message, that are decent, that are good for years, and she can't get the funding, she can't get the financing for them. So it's not just there isn't that there's somebody that's so powerful. Everything is corporatized, so everything is about making money, because now a movie can cost $200 million, more than that, 400 million. It's phenomenal. And if those films go down, then a studio can be destroyed. So people are very, very careful about what they make. On the other hand, there are a lot of young filmmakers that are working on shoestrings, and I think that's the way to do it anyway. I think what Clooney was saying is true in terms of output. The problem is that all these people end up gravitating eventually to the mainstream, because that's where they can make a living. Doing a small film that is you shop around film festivals is not, it's going to be very hard to make a living.
Sure. Thank you, Sidi. I think in line with what you've mentioned about that, where you said that certain filmmakers, I would say, I think Sidi Mustafa Davis mentioned it yesterday, bootstrap, where is it basically they just they use their own resources, borrow money here, but it's independent films, and and he said that when it comes to that kind of struggle, the kind of quality that film that they do, sometimes has zero budget, but the quality that comes out is really amazing and it's really pure in terms of their sincerity.
Yeah, I mean, Mustafa is a good example of someone who he's skating around, all of the financial issues and just doing films that he's interested in. And I think that's the way really to go. But then he's limited in his resources. And, I mean, I know Mustafa, I'm very close to him. So I know what he does is what he can manage to do within the limits of his budget. But if you want to do something more than that, I have another friend who's an independent filmmaker and very, very talented. And he has big ideas, but they're very hard to finance. They take lots of money. So he has a lot of projects that are in development, but he can't get financing for them. And they're very creative, and he loves doing it, and he's going ahead with doing it. But getting the financing to actually get the film into production is a whole other thing altogether, because it's very expensive. Once you have to go on vacation, and if you use special effects and so on and so forth.
And that's very interesting, CD Michael. I know the two examples that you mentioned. I would say, one of your friends, he has a big ambition. However, it's difficult technically or rather, it requires a lot of resources. And then we have examples like filmmakers like Sidi Mustafa, who is like in bootstraps, like you really find your means. My question is, are there different methods of going about this filmmaking process? Is there a certain right way or wrong way of doing a film? Or what are some of your observations on the different kinds of filmmaking techniques or processes? Yeah.
Well, film is a technological phenomenon, and there are certain restrictions, and I don't think there's any particular right way or wrong way. But I'm of the opinion that you have to master the rules before you break them. Picasso, for example, was a classically trained painter. He had extraordinary technique. He had mastered the rules, and then he broke them. Today, artists of all kinds break rules they don't understand and have never followed in the first place.
Yeah.
Like at the Tate Modern Gallery in London, I've seen broken toilets and painted orange crates that are presented as serious modern art. But on the other hand, you have an utterly inspired artist like Anthony Gormley breaking all the rules and making new ones. His work is endlessly breathtaking. There's this ineffable factor that we call talent or even genius at work. So that's part of it. I mean, part of it is talent and vision and the mastery of the technology of film. These are things that you have to master. If you don't know what you're doing, maybe you'll be lucky you can do something, but you really have to follow the rules or understand the rules before you break them. There are certain principles, for example, that are organic. A story has to have a beginning, middle, and an end. Audiences need that kind of structure. If you're going to break it, then you had better know exactly what you're doing. In other words, we know that why is this organic? Well, we're born, we live, and then we die. We have a beginning, middle, and an end. This is inherent in the being. And if you start breaking that, you have to know what you're doing. Like, for example, the films of Andy Warhol back in the 70s were these endlessly, nothing happened in them, you know, and everyone, they were very trendy because he was a celebrity. But they're really awful films, and they're boring, and they're talentless. They're just curiosities if you're interested. On the other hand, the film Birdman, which I mentioned before, seems to break all kinds of rules, but it retains a beautiful structure. It has a beginning, middle, and an end, and it's incredibly satisfying as well as being fantastically original. It's very, very original, and it's invested with a profound meaning as well. So it works on every level. But this is a filmmaker that understands he's mastered the technique of film, so he can start playing with it.
Inshallah. I think it's almost reminds me of the word adab almost, CD Michael, like how you put things in a proper place, in a sense that, you know, in order for you to actually, you know, go towards the advanced levels, you really need to, you know, start from the basics, really know the structure before you actually, you know, a master would know what they're doing, but a beginner would look at the master and think, oh, I know what he's doing, I'm gonna just do that. But then they haven't seen the years of work that they've done and that process that got them to be able to make such a decision.
Right. Well, I mean, at the beginning, I think Picasso said that novices copy and masters steal. So, you know, a novice filmmaker will, you know, inevitably copy someone and maybe fail, maybe succeed, depending on how facile they are. But someone who really has mastered a form, they can take an idea and make it their own. They steal it, so then it becomes something else anyway. It becomes theirs, you know.
MashaAllah. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Yes, CD Michael, I think we want to scope the conversation into another aspect of what you do. You are very appreciative of films, but at the same time, you are also a writer. I thought we want to touch a little bit on that. I have in my hands the book that I read a long time before I actually managed to meet you in Singapore, and that is Science on the Horizon: Meetings with Men of Knowledge and Illumination. But what I wanted to ask you is, in your travels, you have met many saints and scholars of the Muslim world. How has your experience with them influenced your own life journey?
Well, meeting these people has absolutely transformed my life and the way I look at the world, and has, of course, impacted my work as a writer. I mean, I'm very focused on writing about these people, mainly because I like to think about them. You know, I mean, this is a great excuse for me to think about these wonderful people. And they're harder and harder to find people like this now. We, in my generation, we were exposed to great saints or sages, awliya, in who are more apparent. They were more out there. Today, it's harder and harder. It's not so easy, and it's just the sign of the times. It's what's happening. But it's had a huge influence on me as a writer. I mean, I actually have, you know, have been influenced on a literary level by the writings of great Sufi masters. You know, I have influences like Tom Wolfe and Evelyn Waugh from a literary point of view, but I also am influenced by Ibn Ata'illah al-Iskandari, the way that he wrote, by Imam al-Ghazali. Just the way that they think, the way that they write has had a huge impact on me. And also, they've reordered my priorities. My priorities are different than they were before I met these people.
Mashallah, that's very, very interesting, Sidi Michael. I remember there's a particular, I mean, there are many beautiful chapters inside, but towards the end of one of the chapters, you mentioned what one of the great sages, Sheikh Sheikh Ahmad Mashhur, Habib Ahmad Mashhur al-Haddad, he mentioned that, you know, people speak of the evil eye, but there's also the good eye. The good eye exists, you know, and I think it's such wisdom that, you know, profoundly changes the way you look at life. And you know, when the focus just changes when you, because a lot of people just focus on the evil eye, you know, oh, you can't do this, you can't do this, but you listen to some pearls of wisdom like that, it just profoundly changes your lens and you don't see the world in the same way, and your heart also kind of like becomes uplifted. You know, would you say that this is something that they have an effect on you, like they just change the way you see life and in your heart?
Yeah. Yes, because one of the things is they see the best in everything. The awliya that I've met, they don't judge you at all. They see you as you are on a journey, and some of those who have kashf, they see who you will end up as. Usually, they don't tell you anything, but they see that Allah is Arhamar Rahimin, the most merciful of the merciful. That he's the most generous of the generous. They give you hope. But at the same time, you know, if misbehaving yourself without saying anything, you feel like you're doing something wrong. When you're in their presence, you know, you feel that that you're off. But not because they're telling you you're off. It's just that you're in the presence of someone who's pure and who has a very good opinion of the world. I mean, one of the things that's the most important aspect of the lives of these people is they have a good opinion of Allah and His creation. So you sit with these people. One of the awliya, he had a dream of the Prophet ﷺ, and he said, "Ya Rasulullah, tell me what the best thing to do in this world. What is the best thing to do in this world?" And the Prophet ﷺ said in the dream, to sit with a wali Allah, with a friend of Allah, for as long as it takes to milk a goat or cook an egg. That's, you know, sitting with these people is very, very important. It's very transformative, and all of the sages and masters of the spiritual path recommend that you do that whenever possible. You sit with these people because they have a healing. Because and what is it that you learn from them? Yes. They've overcome their ego. They don't have an ego anymore. And this Western modern society, let's say, not just Western, but global modern society is all ego driven. I mean, we're told that we have to make a mark in the world. We have to be great. We have to be amazing. We have to be this. We have to be that. This is all ego. And what these people have is that they don't, their ego's gone. It's extinguished. And they're still people. They're still very human. They have, they're frail in some cases. They're not infallible or anything, but their ego is gone. They don't get angry. They don't have moods. They're just there. They're with Allah, and they're there for other people because they're not thinking about themselves all the time. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
So it is very transformative to sit with these people because you learn so much just by sitting with them, the way they behave, their fine fine adab. One of our old friends was relating a story of sitting with Sheikh Mohammed ibn Habib, who was over 100 years old. This is when he was probably about 18 years old or 19 or something, and he'd just come to the Zawiya. He was an English guy who didn't know much. And Ibn Habib came down. He's over 100, right? He's over close to 100 years old. He sat down with him and taught him Qul Huwallahu Ahad himself.
Allah.
This is what these people are like. So sitting with them is just, it's like a treasure to be able to sit with these people and just watch them and see how they behave and what they say, and we're lucky, to be able to have that experience.
I think, Sidi Michael, hearing you speak about the awliya and the scholars that you've met, I think it really touches my heart because, in a sense, there are times when you reflect on it and you reflect on how they teach you about the mortality of life and what really matters. You know what I mean? Like you mentioned about the film industry. There's certain things that there are elements of it that might not necessarily be something good for your soul. And our topic for tonight is connection to the soul through film. So I guess what I'm really saying is, how is it that you feel that through the influences you're being with the awliya has, do you think that this is something that society needs more of, so that it will shape society's morals and values, in terms of the films that they watch? Or do you think that what's your opinion on the importance of the awliya and the scholars in affecting culture and morality?
That's a hard question to answer. I mean, I don't think you're talking about two very different things. I mean, I'll have to be honest with you. I'm not an advocate of the cinema. I don't think it's important in that context. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
I'll tell you a story, which is a charming story. One of the really great awliya of Africa was crossing, he was making Hajj and overland, and he crossed the desert. He was an ascetic who was, completely reclusive and away from the modern world, absolutely. But he made Hajj, and to get to Mecca, he had to pass through Sudan, and they went through Sudan, and he and the Hujjaj went through Khartoum, and they passed by a cinema house. This is probably in the 50s or 60s, and on the wall of the cinema was a crude painted advertisement for the movie that was playing, which was a Western. And it was, the image was of two cowboys shooting, having a gunfight, right? And the sheikh could not understand why anyone in their right mind would want to watch two people shooting guns at each other. It was just inconceivable to him. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
But we all can, because we have all these cultural references. But in the scheme of things, if you're on a spiritual path, these things are completely art. To be honest, it can inspire you to spirituality, but I don't think it's essential at all. I don't think that the arts are integral, but there's something that can be very supportive. And the fact of the matter is, we have these arts. We have plastic arts. We have figurative arts. We have all these things. So if we're engaged in the world, and as Muslims, we're supposed to be engaged in the world, but in a particular way. Now, in terms of filmmaking, there's something different.
Okay.
I mean, movies have an incredibly powerful and, I'm afraid, troubling impact on morality and the values we live by. There's something to think about. All the fine arts, music, figurative and non-figurative painting, sculpture, architecture, poetry, literature, calligraphy, even theater, have sacred antecedents. Cinema does not. The cinema emerged as an art form between the two world wars in what is arguably the first atheist century in recorded history. The 20th century witnessed two catastrophic wars, the advent of nuclear destruction, the dominance of scientism, and the concomitant loss of faith, and the revolutionary transformation of the two of the world's largest countries into officially atheist nation states. So I believe the cinema's origins are rooted in a kind of existential atheism that marked the centuries, the 20th century. And it's interesting that the Soviets, the communists in the Soviet Union, were early and enthusiastic adopters of cinema as a propaganda tool, as were the Nazis, two cruel and destructive cults. And on the other hand, people of faith have been very slow in accepting cinema. And I'll give you an example.
Okay.
Back in the early 1980s, I interviewed Bollywood superstar Dilip Kumar for a series of articles I was writing on Indian cinema. Anyone who knows about Indian movies will be aware that Dilip Kumar, Hindu name notwithstanding, is a Muslim whose given name is Yusuf Khan. So I asked him why he changed his name. And he told me that when he got the chance to be in Bombay talkies movies back in the 1940s, he didn't want his father, who was a traditional Muslim trader, to find out that he was acting, which was disgrace in that time. He thought that he would try it out, then move on to something more respectable, and his father would be none the wiser. But of course, he became this huge movie star. So I asked him if his father ever accepted him as an actor, and he said, not really, although he accepted the fact that his son was successful and affluent. And this attitude, which hasn't changed all that much since the 1940s, has meant that movies, by and large, are in the hands of secular artists. If God is addressed at all in mainstream or art movies, he is addressed as an absence, not a presence. The Museum of the Museum of Modern Art published a book on faith in film. The title is significant. It's called The Hidden God. So in our time, in the 21st century, we're witnessing the total eclipse of all values and attempts to create new systems of values. I mean, the radicalization of gender identity is one striking example of this. And movies are reflections of these trends. And one of the things I find incredibly disturbing now is how dark, violent, and immoral movies have become. Many of the most popular movies and streamed series are about people on their way to hell. Breaking Bad, which was hugely popular, and The Peaky Blinders are two examples. Maybe you could go on and on about that. It's so we have a problem as Muslims with the cinema itself. There's this idea of creating a Muslim cinema.
Okay.
But frankly, there is no such thing as Muslim cinema. There's no such thing as Christian cinema or Jewish cinema or Hindu or Buddhist cinema. Cinema these are sectarian designations. They're not.
Yes.
I think what's more interesting is creating a sacred cinema, a cinema where you reflect the presence of God. And how do you do this?
Yes.
One of my friends, Abdullah Schleifer, who was journalist, but also an intellectual, used to say the problem with film is it can't track baraka, right? You can't see if someone is luminous. You go into a room and someone's luminous. You can't recreate that that illumination on film. I mean, people have tried to do it, and it just doesn't work because it's something in the heart, or an opening in the heart. It's very personal. You can't track that. But I've thought about Abdullah's comment, and I'm not sure I agree with it, because Allah is al-batin, but Allah is also a dhahir. Allah is hidden and He's manifest. And we can see we can't see Allah, but we can sense Allah through the manifestation of His names and attributes in the creation and in human beings. And I think one of the filmmakers that comes closest to capturing this is the Iranian filmmaker Majid al-Majidi. His films are infused with a kind of, I would say baraka, but all of the characters are decent. They're kind. Their human nature is decent. They're helpful. They help each other. They're kind. There's this great feeling of mercy that permeates his movies. And there's a particularly interesting film, which is an early film of his, a short film called God Will Come. And I suggest anyone who wants to get a sense of what I'm talking about, screen that film. It's beautiful. You can find it on YouTube, as a matter of fact. There isn't enough of that, and I think and plus it's like I said before, it's very hard to get financing for these kinds of films, in particularly in the West, because the West, the cinema is dominated by a kind of secular prejudice. It's now fashionable to be an atheist. In the 19th century, I think it would have been very exceptional for anyone to openly say they didn't believe in God. Now everybody, lots of people say that, and it's perfectly acceptable.
By that same token, CD Michael, filmmakers, they can be considered as culture makers in the sense that they play a role in institutionalizing certain norms and narratives, like minority representation in film, for example. Like in recent years, Muslim characters in Western film tend to be depicted as threatening, or certain characters, they kind of are the first to die off first. They're first to die off in the story. Do you think filmmakers should navigate this cultural responsibility? Is this something that is on their shoulders, so to speak?
Well, first of all, where are the Muslim filmmakers in mainstream or even independent movies? Nowhere in sight. They can't navigate this cultural responsibility if they don't exist. Hollywood creates imaginal landscapes filled with stereotypes of all kinds. Always has, always will. These are telegraphic images that make storytelling easier. In aggregate, African Americans and American Indians have been far more harshly maligned by Hollywood throughout its history than Muslims. And the crude stereotypes of African Americans and American Indians weren't countered until after the civil rights movement in the late 1960s. Stereotypes are an expression of what is other, alien, foreign, exotic, and they exist in absence of understanding and alternative images. The onus is on Muslims to provide this understanding and the alternative images themselves. Otherwise, stereotypes will persist. And I don't know of any committed Muslims working in the film industry. Frankly, they've avoided it. Generation after generation after generation of young people have opted for engineering and business and that sort of thing, and they're not interested in filmmaking. In mainstream movies, Muslims, if they show up at all, are usually depicted as either victims or villains, like you said. They're plot devices. To overcome a minority stereotype, it's necessary to present a minority as normative. as ordinary people within the context of the story. This is how the gay community, which is heavily represented in Hollywood, overcame the stereotype and then some. One film that does this for Muslims is the 1998 movie A Perfect Murder, which is an adaptation of an old Hitchcock film called Dial M for Murder, directed by Andrew Davis and starring Michael Douglas and Gwyneth Paltrow. But the coolest character in the movie is the detective investigating the attempted murder. What's extraordinary about this is that the detective just happens to be an Arab American Muslim. His being Muslim has nothing at all to do with the plot. He just happens to be a Muslim. And I thought that was fascinating. I read an interview with the screenwriter, and he said something like, I have Muslim friends, or I think maybe he said Palestinian friends, and I'm sick of the way they're being portrayed in movies, so I wrote this character as a Muslim. The funny thing is that when I showed the movie to Muslim friends, they never get it. They always miss the point. They don't see it. I'm saying, don't you see the guys? I mean, part of the problem is that the actor, very good actor, David Suchet, has an appalling Arabic. His Arabic is just dreadful. So that, that kind of spoils it a little bit. But if Muslims want to be portrayed differently, they need to be represented in the mainstream film industry, and they need to write films where Muslims are portrayed as ordinary people, part of society. That's a tall order given the way mainstream movies are produced today, but it isn't impossible. But you need people that want to do that sort of thing and go through all of the trouble. And it's very difficult. Like I said, if I have the choice between astaghfirullah, reading Quran and doing dhikr and making a movie, I'm going to do dhikr. I mean, I'm an old guy now, so maybe that's just, but it's all consuming, that kind of work. It's very, very difficult. It's very demanding. You have to have someone who is not only committed to Islam, but who is committed to the craft of filmmaking in some way or another. And hopefully we'll find young people will come into this.
Inshallah. See, Michael, having said that, you mentioned that, Muslims are not really in the scene in order to change that narrative that we just spoke about, and now we have to deal with whatever environment of films that we have in our midst. What kind of films would you recommend for those of us seeking to watch films as a means to tap into the depth of their soul, have a deeper appreciation for humanity?
Well, I would start with the films of Akira Kurosawa, in particular, The Seven Samurai and Redbeard. These are two of the greatest films ever made, and they're deep, deep films. Now, Kurosawa obviously wasn't a Muslim, and he probably might have said that he was an atheist. I don't know, but he was a humanist, and he was also a traditionalist. He came from a samurai heritage, and his films are full of nobility and chivalry and again kindness, and they deal with life and death. And I would strongly recommend that anyone. And one of the things that really kind of struck me is that I've talked to young filmmakers. They have absolutely no exposure to films older than Star Wars. They haven't bothered, and they don't think that there's anything wrong with that. No, there's something wrong with it, because all these films, including Star Wars, which was heavily influenced by Kurosawa's Hidden Fortress, all of the great filmmakers have been influenced by these great films that are made. You need to get a vocabulary, a visual vocabulary, all of these things. So that's the films of Kurosawa. Right off the bat, I would say everyone should study them, look at them. They're beautiful films. The Seven Samurai is like a moving painting. Every frame is stunning. you know, and it's an exciting film. It's you know, inspiring. Everything is, it's got everything going for it. Babette's Feast. It's a Danish film, and it's an amazing story of faith and the alchemy of service and the transmission of blessing through food. It's a beautiful film. Truly, Madly, Deeply is an English film. It's very funny and moving, and it's as an exploration of grief, of someone overcoming loss. And it's really a beautiful film. And again, I mentioned the films of Majid and Majidi, in particular Children of Heaven, which is one of my favorite films. It's nearly it's a little perfect film. And his short film, the one that I mentioned before, God Will Come, they show with a kind of aching beauty and sweetness the presence of God through the character of ordinary people. People are kind, they help each other, they're frail, they're trying hard. You know, it's and you really get a sense of the presence of God. The films of Andrei Tarkovsky are a revelation. They're incredible. Tarkovsky made films at the height of the Soviet era in the 50s and 60s. And I think he was a great believer, but he was living in an atheist society. So everything was kind of coded. He talked a lot about infinity and that sort of thing. That was his code for God. And if you Andrei Rublev, which is an absolutely stunning film, it invokes Christian scripture, but he selects scripture that is in absolute alignment with Islam. I mean, there's nothing at all in the scripture that he uses that we would disagree with, you know, in the invocation of God. So, also the film that I mentioned, Birdman, which is a recent film. It's an incredible, innovative tour de force about the battle between the ego and the soul. And it's really stunning. You know, it's an amazing, like, he really kind of nailed it down, and it's very entertaining. It's brilliantly done. It's very innovative. And, you know, it gives me a little bit of hope in film because there isn't much going on that's like that. Roma is also a beautiful film. It's a Mexican film. And I think it won an Academy Award for Best Foreign Film or something in the year, like a couple years ago. But anyway, it's a really beautiful film. As for old movies, there are so many I could recommend. Anyone interested in film should see Citizen Kane, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, Fallen Idol, The Third Man, Les Enfants du Paradis, Mother India, Moghli Azam, and Buster Keaton's The General, Marx Brothers movies, Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers movies, for starters. I'm really, you know, appalled that young Muslim filmmakers don't seem to have bothered to look at any early cinema or world cinema. The young people I've talked to seem to date movies, as I said, from Star Wars. I talked to a young movie maker who seemed to take pride in the fact that he didn't know anything about movies made earlier than the 1970s or 80s. I think this is wrong. You need to, because this is where you achieve vocabulary. The silent film era, they use techniques that today are still valid, and so much, and you can see where things come from. I showed a younger friend of mine, The Third Man, which has one of the most stunning chase scenes in the film, in movies. And she didn't like it. And I realized she didn't like it because she's seen that chase scene copied dozens and dozens of times. It's so influential, that scene in the sewers of Vienna, that you know, it's been done over and over and over again. But it's important for filmmakers to know where all these references come from. When I was so carry on, sorry.
No, it's okay. Bismillah, Sidi.
No, you go ahead, please.
No, I think what you mentioned about you know, how you know, young filmmakers, from your experience, they kind of only look at the reference point of Star Wars. You know, I think this is something that's very interesting. You also mentioned about building on your vocabulary. Like the more you read, the more you know the scope of things, right? Now you're actually giving advice that watch films with more variety and that has a certain historical significance in certain time of the year, or rather certain time of the narrative of humanity, so that you have a deeper way to describe your films, and it can actually spill over in your work. Like, you know, what kind of other advice would you give filmmakers who are keen on honing their craft, other than all of these that you have mentioned?
Well, when I was an aspiring young actor, a friend and I went to visit the legendary film director George Cukor. He was hugely important in the 30s, 40s, 50s, into the 60s. He was an old man. We went to his home. And my friend had been offered the starring role in a movie, and I was being considered for a co-starring role. But neither of us liked the script. We didn't, you know, it was not a very interesting script. And we mentioned this to Cukor, and he said, well, there isn't much talented being done in Hollywood these days, so my advice to you is keep working. Now, his statement was one of the things that propelled me out of show business. I didn't want to spend my life making junk just to keep working. And that's what people have to do, you know, the best thing going.
Yes.
But it is absolutely the best advice anyone can give a novice. Keep working. If you're a director, find any opportunity to direct. If you're a screenwriter, keep writing. Every day, every day. If you are an actor, find a way to keep working. And if you have talent, you will get better and better at what you do. And hopefully, you'll get a break. You'll be able to have a professional life. The son of one of my oldest friends has been making movies since he was 8 years old. He's incredibly talented. He's very funny. He works with claymation, and he's been getting better and better at it for the last 14 years. He just graduated from film school, smack in the middle of the pandemic. It's a disaster, right?
Yes.
What did he do? He and his film school buddies have started their own company, and they're already making a movie. That's the way to do it. You keep working. And that's all I can say about that.
MashaAllah. That's very profound advice. And I'm sure those who are aspiring filmmakers and in that scene, you know, they would be able to benefit from it, inshallah. Because I think there is definitely a lot of wisdom that, you know, see, Michael, that based on your past experiences, is something that the younger generation can learn from. And I think that if we don't turn to the advice or the wisdom of those who have walked that tread that path, so to speak, you know, then you make mistakes that you could have avoided, or you know, or you just keep on doing something that they already knew a long time ago, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you learn, I mean, once you're in these businesses, you learn the ropes, you get used to it. And it's I mean, one of the things that film has a kind of mystique about it. People are baffled by it and mesmerized by movies because they are very powerful, but they're not that difficult to get into if you have talent. And I think the first thing you have to recognize is whether you have the talent to do something or not. Some people have a very sad kind of life experience trying to do something that they don't have they just don't have the talent for it. They don't have the flair for something, and they keep at it and keep at it until they finally give up because they can't breach the walls of the. But it's actually, if you're talented, you can eventually break through. But then, you know, the problem with these businesses is it's like for a screenwriter, for example, I think 10,000 screenplays are written every year, and only about 100 movies are made. So what happens with the other 9,900 screenplays? You know, what happens with them? And this is, so it can be a very disappointing experience. I have two old friends who I started out with in show business who've been working actors and very successful at times for 50 years. And I saw them last year at a gathering. And I said, I went up to both of them separately and I said, how are things going? And they both said, well, I'm not working now. And these guys are old guys, but they're still looking for work. And that kind of life, that insecurity of, being completely at the mercy of somebody else, and you're always looking for work. That's a difficult thing. Always trying to sell a screenplay, always trying to get a directing, job. It's tough.
Mashallah, Sidi Michael, I think we've had a very insightful conversation with you. However, before we end, I do have one last question, inshallah, on something that really hit me the most based on our conversation. And you mentioned about sincerity, about filmmakers' sincerity and sincerity in everything that you do. Do you have any kind of sharing or advice on how we could cultivate more of such thing, of such a character in whatever that we do?
Well, I think you have to tap into what's in the heart, and you have to be open, and you have to. And I mean, as a Muslim, I would say to Muslims and Muslim creative people, is that you need to realize that we're all helpless. Everything is from God. Every form of expression that we have, every breath we take, every glance that we make is from the qadr of Allah. We're gifted with life, we're gifted with, and sometimes being helpless is the best thing that we can be. I mean, one of the awliya said that if you knew the value of distress, you would only ask Allah to give you distress, because this is where you grow. And it's that vulnerability that produces something true and sincere. And so what you want to try to do is to bind yourself to good intention. Now, that's not always, easy. My daughter she's a designer, a trained designer, but she's working in the digital sphere. And it's a job of work. So, you have to do what you can. And in that sense, you want to you do the best thing that you possibly can, but it may not be your vision particularly or something like that. You just do an excellent job. Always try to work at your highest level, even if what you're doing is let's say trivial, because there's a lot of that in the world today. I mean, I worked for nearly 20 years in the public relations business. I started a company with a colleague of mine, and we built the company into quite a big company. And I never was very interested in the business at all. But I'm a writer, so when I would write something, no matter what it was, whether it was a proposal or like a business proposal or something like let's say a press release or a profile of someone, I tried to make it. I did the best that I could with that, because I had to make a living. I had children that were going through school and all of that, so I had to do that. And I don't regret that at all, because I wrote every day. I kept working. So I refined even though I wasn't doing exactly what I wanted, I was working at the best possible level I could. And that's part of sincerity, is you just you seek excellence, try to do the best you can. Never give up and resort to being a hack or a mediocre whatever it is. Don't even if you're doing something that's mediocre, you try to do the best you can. And Allah sees everything. So one thing will, if your sincerity will take you to something better. I have no doubt about that.
Subhanallah. Very profound advice. I really appreciate the time that we have with you, Sidi Michael. We'd like to thank you again, Sidi Michael, for coming on board to share with us your experience. I think on behalf of Sidi Khalid and Saida Ainun and all of the staff at Sout Ilaahi, we'd like to thank you again for coming on board. And inshallah, we hope to continue, working with you, to inshallah to perhaps events or something else in the future that can benefit more people.
Thank you very much, and keep up the good work. Inshallah.
Yeah, we seek your dua, Sidi Michael. Inshallah. And with that, thank you so much, Sidi Michael. Inshallah, may Allah grant you good health and long life so that inshallah we can continue to benefit from your sharing. And with that, Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala barakatuh. Thank you so much, Sidi. Take care.